Başkanı'nı masaya davet ediyorum. Sunumlarını yapmak üzere Avrupa İnsan Hakları Mahkemesi Macar Yargıcı Bey'i,
Günaydın değerli konuklar, sevgili meslektaşlar, sayın başkanlar. Dün başlayan İnsan Hakları Sempozyumumuzun bugünkü birinci oturumunu açıyorum. Konuşmacılarımıza söz vermeden önce birkaç teşekkür ifade etmek istiyorum. Dünden beri, hatta bir önceki akşamdan beri başta Denizli Boromuzun değerli başkanı Adil Demir olmak üzere buradaki bütün ilgililerden, yetkililerden gördüğümüz olağanüstü konukseverlik için yalnız kendi adıma değil, eminim bütün konukların da hislerini ifade ederek teşekkürler ediyorum. Çok üst düzey bir ağırlama oldu. Tabii en az bunun kadar değerli bilgi alışverişi de oldu. Çok değerli bilgiler edindik. Bütün bunlar için bir kere daha huzurumuzda teşekkürlerimi ifade etmek benim için çok zevkli bir görev oluyor. Bugünkü oturumumuzun ilk konuşmacısı Sayın Andras Sajo. Kendisi Macaristan'dan geliyor. Avrupa İnsan Hakları Mahkemesi'nde Macaristan adına yargıçlık yapıyor. Burada adına sözünün altını özellikle çiziyorum. Macaristan'ı temsil ediyor. Zaman zaman uluslararası mahkemelerdeki yargıçlar için mesela işte Rıza Türkmen Türkiye'yi Avrupa İnsan Hakları Mahkemesi'nde temsil ediyor gibi ifadeler kullanılıyor ki bu yanlış. Çünkü hakim bağımsızdır. O ülkeden gelir, o ülke adına orada bulunur ama o ülkeyi temsil etme durumunda değildir. Kendi vicdani kanaatine göre hükümler verir. Evet, Andras Sajo Avrupa İnsan Hakları Mahkemesi'nin Macaristan adına görev yapan yargıcı bugün bizlere düşünce ve ifade özgürlüğü, ben bunu yazanlar kadar yaşlı olmadığım için ifade diyemiyorum, düşünce ve anlatım özgürlüğü diyorum. Düşünce ve anlatım özgürlüğü konusunda bir sunum yapacak. Eminim hepimiz istifadeyle dinleyeceğiz.
It is a great honor and pleasure to be here, not only because this gives me a little bit more opportunity to understand Turkish legal system and Turkish problems better. Actually, I do 70% of my time Turkish cases, so it will help me enormously to see reactions. It's also a real pleasure given the relations between Turkey and Hungary. It's a special relationship, so I'm really glad to be here. The topic of the presentation is what's called Article 10 of the European Convention. And this is the article that deals with freedom of expression. The concept of freedom of expression in the European Convention is relatively simple. It is the outcome of an earlier debate, if you wish, that took place in the drafting of another document, the Universal Declaration. And here, two concepts were emerging. One was represented by Eleanor Roosevelt, and the other one by René Cassin, who later was very influential in the drafting of the European Convention. And there was an enormous difference between the two, because Eleanor Roosevelt said freedom of expression is to be protected, and that's what should go into the Universal Declaration. And René Cassin, famous French lawyer and also very close to General de Gaulle, later became a president of the European Court, was of a different opinion, and he said that yes, but freedom of expression carries duties and responsibilities, and that should be written into the declaration. And if you look at the text here in paragraph 1 of Article 10 on the board, you will, that's actually paragraph 2 of Article 10, you will see in the duties and responsibilities are added into this freedom. So it's not an absolute freedom. And not only that it carries duties and responsibilities, but very specific consequences are drawn in the text. Namely, that freedom of expression can be restricted for a number of good reasons. National security, territorial integrity, and so on and so forth. Some of these grounds for restriction we will discuss. By the way, discussion, I really mean discussion. I don't want to speak an hour. I would like to have a question-answer period. So whenever you feel that there is a point, there will be an opportunity to discuss it. So once again, the idea of the European Convention is that freedom of expression is to be protected, but it can be restricted on specific grounds. For someone who is in favor of freedom of expression for whatever reason, this might be somewhat discouraging, because it seems, just reading this text of the Convention, that it is up to the state to enact a law. There's a requirement that restriction has to be done by law. But the state can basically enact a law, claim that this is intended to protect territorial integrity, rights of others, and then that's the end of the story. There is very little protection left. If you read carefully the text of this article, you will see that there is, however, a little hidden phrase which may change this whole equation. And this little change is necessary in a democratic society. And that, in fact, changed in the practice of the court the whole equation. I save you quoting cases. All I would like to say that very early the question was asked, what is necessary for a restriction? What is, in other words, a permissible restriction in a democratic society? And the answer to that was that only pressing social need satisfies the requirement of necessity. So the state is under an obligation to the court to prove that the restriction, or if it's not yet restriction, it's the limitation, that the limitation was really serving not only those listed grounds, but it was serving in a way that is satisfying a pressing social need. Now, how do you determine that a pressing social need is present? Generally, the court will do what's called proportionality analysis. I guess this concept is rather well known in your system as well. So proportionality, that is to say, the measure taken, the limitation taken by the state is not only required by the goal that is recognized, but it has to be such that it is not disproportionate. The goal is not served using a means that is disproportionate. To give a very simple example, even where the court finds that a specific statement, a specific language is perhaps inciting in itself to punish someone to 6 years and 6 months for a single statement is excessive. It's disproportionate with the goal of, that in this case was protecting national security. So it is simply not true that if the goal served by the limitation of speech by legislation and then by judicial decision is legitimate, then any measure, any restrictive measure will be acceptable. It has to be proportionate to the goal to be achieved. So this is basically the approach of the court in a nutshell in these matters. Now let me be a little bit perhaps more interesting and enter into specific problems. The first problem is what do we mean by expression? What is really protected? And behind that, obviously, we have to ask the question, why speech is to be protected? The court generally is reluctant to give a philosophical justification, but it seems to me that most often the justification, the underlying justification of protection granted by the court is that freedom of expression is necessary or even inevitably necessary for the purposes of democracy. So there cannot be democracy without freedom of speech. Let me add that the court, in a number of circumstances, seems to depart from this. What is called commercial speech, advertisement, is also protected in the practice of the court. It's called Mark Intern case. To some extent, literary production is also protected by the court. So it's not limited to the political context or to democracy understood broadly. And this context, I would like to add that some other justifications of free speech are not reflected or not fully reflected in the jurisprudence of the court, which is then a source for criticism. And I will be the last one to express criticism, needless to say. If I do that, that's in dissent opinions. Now, these alternative justifications for free speech are numerous. One is that speech is needed because it's part of self-realization. There can be no human dignity and autonomy without the possibility of expressing yourself. A second possible justification is what is generally related to an American judge, Justice Holmes, which is partly related to a relativist concept of the truth. Because we do not have a clear foundation, a clear knowledge of what's true, what's not, when it comes to ideas, only a competition of ideas will take us closer to truth. And the rule of the law is to enable functioning, a free functioning of the marketplace of ideas. And these concepts result in rather robust protection of free speech. To what extent these considerations are reflected in the jurisprudence of the European Court is to be seen. What we know for fact is that relying on this concept of necessary in a democratic society, in some areas, very strong protection of speech was granted in the past 20 or 30 years. Let me start with something that is still very much a source of violations in the case of Turkey, and that is incitement. Incitement that comes up on the basis, incitement is considered to be a threat to national security or territorial integrity or disorder. So these are some of the grounds for restricting incitement. The difference between the jurisprudence of the European Court and some of the Turkish courts is that the court is not convinced that criminalization of speech where it does not result or does not raise the possibility of violence or hatred is acceptable under the European Convention. So once again, the difference seems to be that for the court, a specific presence of violence as a consequence of the inciting speech or hatred arising from speech is necessary. And if you look at some of the cases, again Turkish cases, you will see that sometimes the speech that was found to be criminal in Turkish courts was very close to generating hatred. It was hateful, no question about that. But that in itself, that the speech expresses hate, is generally, especially if the result is very severe punishment, is found to be a disproportionate restriction. A an intervention that is disproportionate and therefore unacceptable under Article 10 of the Convention. So that's where I think there is a certain difference between the approach in Strasbourg and the approach of most of these cases, by the way, are national security court cases, not all. So that's one area. Now why is the court having this position? Probably because, and it's said in very short paragraphs, because the protection of speech is extended also to what is shocking or disturbing. Opinions that are shocking and disturbing are protected by the European Convention. It's not only nice talk that is to be protected. The court does not go beyond this categorical statement, but I think it's very easy to understand the reasons, because meaningful speech is always hurting someone, and especially those in the position of power. And the court is particularly keen when the speech is attacking the state because of the excessive power that the state has at its disposal. So in the understanding of the court, and of course there are always specific exceptions given circumstances, and the specific situation in the Southeast in the 90s was such an exception. But other than that, generally the court believes that the state is powerful enough to protect its interests without taking excessive measures. The court never said so, but perhaps there is an assumption that the state may even abuse that excessive power. So there is an underlying consideration. Let me move to another area, which is a conflict that exists today. If you look at this list of possible grounds of restrictions, you will see that there is a ground for limitation, namely the protection of the reputation or rights of others. These are two distinct categories. The first one, protection of reputation, basically is the situation of defamation. Other rights can be freedom of religion, so speech directed against free manifestation of religion might be limited on these grounds. But let me start with defamation. Now, defamation is a major area of conflict between freedom of expression and others. And very often, freedom of expression means criticism of persons and institutions, which do not necessarily reach the level of incitement, although sometimes it's construed as incitement. But even without that, criticism, harsh criticism, disrespectful criticism is very often a fundamental technique of political conflict and political debate. And again, democracy as a political institution understood broadly, because if you look at cases we have, school context is also one where similar considerations apply. But once again, criticism of people as expression obviously hurts. And therefore, reputational interest will be damaged. So we have a conflict. In early cases, the question came up from the perspective of Article 10, or in most of the cases. That means that the criticism, defamatory criticism, was sanctioned in a domestic court, and therefore somebody's reputation was protected by the domestic court at the price of imposing a sanction on the speaker, very often on newspapers. And that automatically created the opportunity to bring a complaint, an application, to the European Court relying on Article 10. And the jurisprudence originally developed out of this type of situations. There were a number of reasons for finding that criticism of governmental officials and then of other people who are involved or were involved in public matters, and public matters understood broadly, shall endure a certain restriction of their right to reputation, right to honor. Again, remember that most common is that the reputation of a politician is at stake, either because the newspapers write about what he did or what people believe about the reasons of their activity, or there is a political conflict between two parties, political parties, and of course they engage in a rather harsh dialogue, if I may call it dialogue, and sometimes it's not a dialogue, but just shaming each other. But still, that's how politics goes. And I think there are good reasons to believe that polite exchange of ideas in politics is more serving some kind of dirty compromise or hiding shared misdeeds than being critical, which may also hide misdeeds, but that's a different matter. So there is an interest in enabling strong, even offensive language, as long as it's not gratuitously offensive. That's a consideration of the court. And this became clear, among others, in a case called Lingens, where the Chancellor of Austria was accused of base opportunism. So he's very opportunistic. This was about coalition formation with a former pro-Nazi. The accusation came from a journalist. The Austrian courts convicted in a criminal court the journalist for defamation. There was a problem whether this was an opinion or a fact. Basically, the position of the court was, of the European court was, among others, that a politician who voluntarily exposed himself shall endure more. Not that a politician has less honor, but willingly accepted that his honor might be offended. That was not the fundamental reason, but one of the reasons. The fundamental reason was the nature of the democratic discourse, what is necessary again for the political process. And the political process, as understood by the European Court, requires a strong and robust speech, which includes offensive speech. If I may add a personal note to this, indeed, without such approach, there is a danger that politicians, time and again, will rely on their concept, their personal concept of honor. And that will have a major sensorial impact. In this case, or in this type of cases where the reputation of politicians and people dealing with public interest, or subject matters dealing with public interest, are at stake, a specific consideration is to be mentioned, which is the role of the press. Most of the times, as in the Lingen's case, the criticism that is really offending comes from the press, or by someone who publishes in the press. The concept of the press was extended in the last few years. Basically, anyone who regularly contributes to the press gets press protection. Even these days, people teaching at universities get that kind of protection because they are part of this specific role that the court attributes to the press, which is called the watchdog function. The press is acting like a watchdog. Basically, it doesn't bite but barks when there is a problem. Sometimes it bites too, but that's not a problem that comes up in the European Court. So there is a specific role attributed to the press in a democratic society. And therefore, the press seems to receive specific protection. And that includes a certain largesse, a certain permissiveness that is related to the way the press functions. Because under specific circumstances, under the pressure that the press has to produce news, it is not always able to check everything with the precision of an ordinary court. So even statements which are not fully supported by facts will be protected by the European Court, at least when the press acted according to professional responsibility, professional ethics. Let me give you an example. It's a blooded Tromsø case, the Norwegian case. Here, and it's interesting because it is not about politicians. It tells you that it's not only politicians, but public interest is what matters. So here there were some fishermen in Norway, and on a ship called Harmony, and they were seal hunters. Now, that is a respected profession in Norway, and the city, Tromsø, is basically dependent on seal hunting. Unfortunately, seal hunting is not just hunting, but probably the most cruel butchery of seals. And someone was preparing documentation of that for the government. The government information, this report on the murder of all these seals, was confidential, was not yet disclosed. But it was leaked, or this person actually gave it to this newspaper, the local newspaper. The local newspaper published it and then asked the fishermen, the sailors of this ship, Harmony, whether what is their opinion. So there was an exchange on this matter, whether they kill the seals in a sadistic way or not. And this was then considered by the fishermen, not what they said, but what was written originally, to be defamatory, and under Norwegian law this was very specific form of crime or misdemeanor. So the newspaper at the end of the day was convicted in Norwegian courts and in Sweden. The case came to the European Court of Human Rights, and one of the reasons of finding a violation of Article 10, that is to say that the conviction of the newspaper was unacceptable, was based on the fact that the newspaper basically acted professionally, in the sense that they relied on an available document which was in preparation, and they gave the opportunity for the fishermen to make their views heard. So it was within what was considered to be professional ethics. Now this is very interesting because it said that perhaps the facts were wrong. Perhaps it's not true. The newspaper was unable to prove the butchering of the seal. That would have been a defense, right? If it's true, you may still have some problems whether it's defamatory, but generally defense of truth is sufficient for in a defamation case. Here, it was impossible to prove that they were butchering the seal, although, and this was denied, of course, by the Norwegian Parliament. A few weeks later, CNN produced a distributed worldwide a shot of several minutes when you could see these, but it was not on harmony, so it was immaterial. I'm not in the position to say whether this is actually happened on harmony, but it was clear that it happens generally in seal hunting in Norway. Perhaps harmony was an exception. Anyway, that was immaterial because the newspaper could not prove the facts of the allegation. And yet, the European Court was of the opinion, in its majority at least, that this became the law, the precedent, that although the facts were not proven, the allegations made were sufficiently related to a factual basis, sufficient in the sense that they were satisfying professional requirements. The press is not required to produce absolute truth. You don't have to prove absolute truth in a court in order to have defense interpretation. So that's basically how the press is treated. And at this point, because I was talking about facts and opinions, I would like to say that there is an additional element in the jurisprudence of the court which says that offensive opinions are not absolutely protected, but if there is some factual basis, if it's not completely arbitrary what is in the statement, then the offensive opinion is protected. So that's another major element of the question. Now let me finish this by certain new developments. There is a growing criticism of the freedom of expression jurisprudence of the court, especially what happened in the last 2 years. So my Spanish colleague is certainly not responsible for that. What the criticism says is that in the last 2 years, in the name of protection of reputation, the court is abandoning its Article 10 jurisprudence. This is partly related to a set of other cases which are so-called Article 8 decisions. Article 8 is about the protection of private life. Now, what happens if someone is losing in a domestic court, a defamation case, a person who was defamed, who believes that his reputation was offended. But then the domestic court says, no, well, maybe, but we have to protect freedom of expression because of the European Convention. And therefore you are not getting protection for reputation, that you lose the defamation case. Then that person will apply, and did apply to the European Court for having Article 8 private life includes reputation, to have private life rights violated. And then a different balancing begins with sometimes different results. So what happened? Suddenly an Article 8 jurisprudence emerged which seems to be in a difficult relationship with the jurisprudence that emerged under Article 10. And that created a certain tension. And on top of that, on this basis, even in some Article 10 cases now, there seems to be more emphasis, more interest in protecting reputation and interests. Some of my colleagues in public speeches explain that by the complexity of the issues. In early cases, classic cases, the problems were somewhat isolated. But with a growing jurisprudence, with more and more robust protection, for example, to private life, the conflict became inevitable, and perhaps the emphasis is shifting. Again, without comments, I would like to mention just one development, and I will start here, which is a French case. It's a Linden, Ochatowski et Julie, contre France. In this case, which is an Article 10 case, a novel was at stake, really at stake. The following happened. There was a novel, fiction, which dealt with extreme right-wingers in France, who were the followers of Le Pen, the French radical right-wing leader, who at the time was a member of European Parliament. And in this fiction, which was based on two race-based murders committed by the followers of Le Pen from National, on this basis, certain attributions were made, namely that, this is a quote from the novel, that Le Pen leads a crowd of Nazi murderers. I mean, not Nazi murderers, just murderers. And other statements. Now, on the basis of these and similar statements, the writer of the novel was convicted in France. The European Court said that the conviction is acceptable, does not violate the European Convention of Human Rights, Article 10. Now, there were others in this case, namely a newspaper, Libération, which reproduced these quotes, which were found by the French court to be problematic. And it was reproduced because some 97 or so French intellectuals signed a petition which was criticizing the position of the French courts. So then again they had to quote what was at stake in the decisions. Now that again was found by the French authorities to be defamatory. And so the newspaper, the editor, the responsible editor of the newspaper, was convicted under French law. And again, the European Court said that this is not a violation of the convention. So this is why the criticism that I was mentioning was raised. This is why some people believe that the court is departing from its earlier jurisprudence. The dissenting opinions in this case emphasize that this is a piece of fiction. And as a piece of fiction, you should trust the readers to understand that there is a difference between what you say in a novel and what you say in real life. And after all, if you ever read Shakespeare, you would certainly conclude that this is full of the most calumnious, inciting speech you ever imagined against the state. By state here I mean the king. So if there is nothing new under the sun, and yet the French authorities and the European Court is perhaps not having much sympathy to Shakespeare. Now, on this note, I cannot outdo Shakespeare, I will stop here, and I will be very happy to have questions and try to answer them.
Avrupa İnsan Hakları Mahkemesi yargıçlarından Sayın Andras Sayon'un çok ilginç tebliğini birlikte dinledik. Eminim sizler de benim gibi çok yararlandınız. Anlatım özgürlüğü gibi gerçekten yalnız Türkiye için değil, bütün ülkeler için önemli bir konuda özgürlüğün ne ölçüde, hangi durumlarda sınırlanabileceğine ilişkin çok ihtilaflı noktaların bulunduğunu bir kere daha gördük. Ben şahsen çok yararlanarak dinledim. Şimdi sana diyorum 20-25 dakika soru için zamanımız olacak. İsterseniz soruları şimdi alalım. Ondan sonra bir kahve arası olacak. Ondan sonra ikinci konuşmamızı dinleyelim. Ne diyorsunuz başkan, uygun değil mi? Peki efendim, o zaman ilk önce sizi gördüm, sonra sizi gördüm. Başka atladığım varsa bilmiyorum. Buyurun lütfen. Sizi de gördüm. Evet. Lütfen kendinizi tanıtın.
Ben sorum şu, İsviçre'de bir kanun var. Ermeni soykırımıyla ilgili. Soykırımı yoktur diyenler yargılanıyor. Bu konuda.
Sayın meslektaşım, tercüme edildiği için biraz daha tempoyu düşürerek konuşur musunuz?
Ermeni soykırımıyla ilgili, Ermeni soykırımı vardır diye bir yasa var İsviçre'de. Bu Ermeni soykırımı yoktur diyenler yargılanıyor. Bu konuda ne düşünüyorlar? Bu konuda ne düşündüklerini merak ediyorum.
Teşekkür ederiz. Evet efendim, o zaman ikinci, buyurun. Tercümanlarımızın işini zorlaştırmamak adına sizden de aynı dileği yapayım.
Avukat İrfan Akyürek, İstanbul. İfade özgürlüğü ile ilgili 10. maddede sınırlayan kriterlerin de sınırı demokratik toplumda gerekli olan zorunlu tedbirler. Bunları da ikinci fıkrasında yazıyor. Ulusal güvenlik 47 tane üye devlet olduğuna göre hepsinde farklı anlamlara geliyor. Kaldı ki bizim ülkemizde bile ulusal güvenlikten ne anlaşıldığı zaman zaman değişiklikler şeklinde görülüyor. Kamu emniyeti en çok sıkıntı çektiğimiz konulardan bir tanesidir. Kamu düzeni benzer şekilde zamana göre bile değişen, şüphesiz ki ülkelere göre bile değişen kavramlar ve anlatımlardır. Ayrıca ahlakın korunması, şöhretin korunması gibi, hele ahlakın korunması gibi bir kavram, bir ülkenin bölgeler arasında bile farklılık gösterebilir. Özellikle ülkemiz bakımından söylüyorum, terörist başı olduğu mahkeme kararı ile hüküm altına alınmış olan bir kişiye bir zamanlar sayın denmesi suç oluyordu. Suçu ve suçluyu övmek şeklinde değerlendiriliyordu. Mahkemiyet kararları veriliyordu. Aynı kişinin talimatıyla, emirleriyle ülkemize geldiği kabul edilen insanlar şimdi neredeyse kırmızı hatlarla karşılanıyor. Bu konuda Avrupa İnsan Hakları Mahkemesi'nin ülkelere göre ya da bütün ülkeleri kapsayan şekilde kriteri az önce söylediğim demokratik toplum için gerekli olan, zorunlu olanın dışında bir kriter var mıdır? Biz bunu nasıl ayrılacağız? Teşekkür ederim.
Avukat adli ben özellikle ifade özgürlüğünün kişinin dini değerlerine, milli değerlerine, ahlaki değerlerine saldırı olmasıdır bunlar. Korunmaması gerektiği düşüncesindeyim. Bir zamanlar Gazanlık'ta Hazreti Muhammed'e hakaret kapsamında karikatürler falan yayınlanmıştı. Hala bunun yarısı Türk toplumunda mevcuttur, İslam toplumunda mevcuttur. Bu şekilde dini değerlere, milli değerlere, manevi değerlere yapılan saldırılarda ifade özgürlüğünün hala şok edici ve rahatsız edici durumlarda dahi ifade özgürlüğü korunmalıdır şeklinde bir ifade bulunsa. Bunu açıklamaya kavuşması veya bu durumda nasıl ifade özgürlüğü korumasının belirlenmesini soruyorum. Tek daha alacağız efendim. Buyurun.
Avukat Adnan Keyser. Efendim ben bir soruya bağlı olarak sormak istiyorum. Her ne kadar İsviçre bir Avrupa devletinden öte özel nitelikli bir alan olarak Avrupa anlaşmalarının dışında bir ülkedir. Açık açık soykırım kararı almış ve bunun yasalarıyla aksini söyleyenler hakkında ceza uygulaması getirmiştir. Ancak asıl merak ettiğim konu şudur. İsviçre ülkesinin almış olduğu ve amacını açıkça belirlettiği ve ifade özgürlüğünü kısıtlamaya yönelik olarak almış olduğunu beyan ettiği bir yasa maddesinin benzerini diğer Avrupa ülkeleri ne maksatla alıyor? Acaba psikolojik olarak İsviçre gibi kişilerin ifade özgürlüğünü kısıtlamak ya da tarihi incelemeleri etkilemek maksatla alıyor. Bu konudaki sayın sunucunun kanaatini öğrenmek istiyorum. Teşekkür ederim.
Sayın konuşmacı bir tek daha soru alabilecek. Buyurun. Bu son olsun çünkü vakit takılıp elimiz de yoruldu.
Emniyet Amiri Ali İstanbul'a öncelikle Sayın Andras Hoca'ya ülkemize geldikleri için hoş geldiniz diyorum. Ülkemizde 2911 sayılı toplantı ve gösteri yürüyüşleri kapsamında çeşitli yerlerde toplantı ve gösteri yürüyüşleri legal alanda legal platformda ülke amirleri gösterdikleri yerlerde yapılmaktadır. Ancak bütün dünyada olduğu ülkemizde de basın açıklaması adı altında bir takım etkinlikler düzenlenmektedir. Basın açıklamaları kapalı alanlarda olduğu gibi açık alanlarda da yapılabilmektedir. Basın açıklamaları ülkemizde ifade özgürlüğü kapsamında değerlendirildiğinden herhangi bir resmi müracaata gerek kalmaksızın kişiler, tüzel kişiler veya gerçek kişiler tarafından yapılabilmektedir. Ancak açık alanlarda yapılan bu basın açıklamaları zaman zaman genel güvenliği tehlikeye düşürdüğü gibi ihtiva ettiği konular itibariyle halk üzerinde infial uyandıracak nitelikte de olabilmektedir. Ben Sayın Konuğumuza şunu sormak istiyorum. İfade özgürlüğü kapsamında açık alanlarda yapılan bu basın açıklamaları, katılımcı sayısı, kapladığı alan ve zaman açısından bir sınırlama getirilmesini ifade özgürlüğü kapsamında nasıl değerlendirilebileceği, eğer bu bahsetmiş olduğu 3 şekliyle bir sınırlama getirilebilecek ise bunun standartlarının ne olabileceğini kendi görüşlerini almak istiyorum. Teşekkür ederim.
Teşekkür ederiz efendim. Başka soru alamıyorum.
Thank you for these excellent questions. Let me start by saying that I cannot say anything if you meant by genocide the issue of what concerns Turkey, because we have cases pending on this. But I can tell you something on the Holocaust related to genocide, that is to say extermination of Jews, because there we have a very clear jurisprudence. And by the way, I think it makes a difference whether someone is criminalized for denying the occurrence of mass atrocities compared to discussing the possibility that it occurred. So these are two separate legal issues. We have jurisprudence on the denial of the occurrence. These are actually not Swiss but German cases. Sorry, these are surprisingly French cases. There are lots of German domestic cases which also upheld this, but we have a French case which is called the Garodi case. It's a French communist philosopher who then converted to Islam and wrote a book basically denying that the Jews were killed to that extent in terms of numbers, and then relied on the establishment of Israel. In that case, a different article of the convention was applied. This is called Article 17. Basically, this prohibits reliance on a convention right with the intent to destroy the convention system. It's an abuse of rights concept, and it was held that this type of speech, this type of utterance, is not protected expression under Article 10. Technically, the case was inadmissible. So, in other words, once again, a person who denied the occurrence of the Holocaust in Germany could not say, could say but unsuccessfully, that when he was convicted in France, his freedom of expression rights were violated because the court was of the opinion that such utterances are not speech because they go against the very convention. So that's that part of genocide. Now, let me go to the other specific question, meetings and press conference. We have a number of decisions rendered in the past 3 or 4 years. And basically, the court is of the opinion that press conference, open air, is part of what is protected under Article 11, freedom of assembly, in conjunction with Article 10. And the court is of the opinion that the presence of a huge crowd, even if the press conference language is very aggressive or condemns the state, is protected. So if you convict someone for that, or even if you disperse immediately the press conference, that is a violation of the convention, because the state is unable, in this case, these are explicitly Turkish cases, so I would say the Turkish state is unable to prove that the threat is real, that is to say that it is inevitable that on the spot something will happen that amounts to disruption of disorder that is disproportionate. Demonstrations to some extent always cause some inconvenience. That's the price we pay for freedom. And and sometimes it's very unpleasant, I must say. Personally, as a citizen, I'm not always happy when the public transportation is paralyzed. But that's exactly what rights are about. They represent a certain priority. So if freedom of meeting, freedom of assembly, or freedom of expression was singled out as a fundamental human right, that means that other interests are not on the same level. So very specifically your question, as long, and again at the level of practicalities, if the meeting, the press conference, open air press conference is not going forever, if it's not really a blockade, but it is within a reasonable time, then it is protected. And you cannot just disperse it saying that perhaps the people will be agitated. Especially where the police was informed and a state is expected to provide forces of order that provide order, and not that the citizen is to be extremely orderly. So, in a way, a proactive intervention, that is to say, some kind of dialogue, is the idea for this. Now let me go to what I think is very helpful for this presentation. What are the general standards, if there are, about national security? What is the role of the court? This will also answer the question not answer, but deal with the question on morale and religion. So what I suppose was already told yesterday, the European Court has a very specific role in the European human rights protection system, which is described as a role of subsidiarity.